Hello everybody, so we're going to be looking at alcohols today, specifically the oxidation of alcohols. So we've come across oxidation before at the end of Unit 1, we've also looked at alcohols, and you're going to need the following. You're going to need your Unit 2 notes, which you may wish to fill out as you go through, or you could maybe do it at the end or annotate as you go through. Your data book, pen and a paper. I don't think you need a calculator today. So let's get started with your prior knowledge questions. So we've got an oxidation equation here. Can you identify from this what is the, sorry, got an ion electron equation. Can you identify what is the oxidation reaction here? So the way that I go about this is I look at both of the reactants, because remember it's only the reactants that are being oxidized or reduced, and I see what's happening to them. So the iodide ions are I negative and they are changing into I2. So how's that happening? Well, the way that that happens is the iodide ions, the I negative, must lose electrons. So if something is losing electrons, we know that therefore that is oxidation. Oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. So our answer is as follows. Next question. Which of the following compounds is a tertiary alcohol? What I recommend you do for this one is to draw the structure of all of these chemicals and then take it from there. Okay, so if you draw the structure of all of them, you should come up with this as being the second one. So this is 2-methyl butan 2-ol. And to identify something as a primary, secondary, or tertiary alcohol, you may remember that we're looking for the carbon that is bonded to the hydroxyl group. And then what we're trying to do is to see how many other carbons are bonded to that carbon. So in this instance here, we have 1, 2, 3 carbons bonded to it. Therefore, B, the 2-methyl butan 2-ol, is the tertiary alcohol. Now, just a little point to note here, this is the best picture I could get of this chemical, but it is actually inaccurate to the standard that we require. The inaccuracy is that one of the carbon bonded to the hydroxyl group, one of the carbons that is bonded to, the bond is not going to the correct place. It's going to a hydrogen as opposed to the carbon. So remember that the bonds at high level have to go to the atoms that they are actually bonded to. And we'll come across this again later on because it is important, primary, secondary, and tertiary alcohols for today's lesson. But here we have an example of a primary on the left, then a secondary, then a tertiary alcohol. And it's always this carbon bonded to the hydroxyl group that you're looking for. Okay, moving on. So I think this should be a fairly straightforward one for you guys. What's that called there, circled? So this is, of course, the carboxyl group, or it's an acceptable answer to write carboxylic acid. So I think for today, it would be really beneficial if you could actually watch this video. It's not too long, and instead of embedding it into this video, I think it would be better if you guys could go to YouTube, search this up, watch this, and that will certainly help you with today's lesson. So come out of here, search it, watch it, and then when you've done that, come back to here, please. So on to today's lesson. So we're going to be looking at the following. Can you state the functional group of aldehydes and ketones? So two new homologous series that we haven't really come across before. Can you name and draw straight chain and branched aldehydes and ketones? Can you define oxidation and reduction in terms of carbon chemistry? And lastly, can you state 1, the products formed, and 2, the oxidizing agents used when alcohols are oxidized? So let's get started. So aldehydes and ketones, the reason why we teach them at the same time is because 1, they share a functional group. Their functional group is the carbonyl group. What makes aldehydes and ketones different is where that functional group is. They also react similarly, so the chemical reactions are similar that they undergo. With an aldehyde, our carbonyl group is found at the end of the molecule. For example, this here. In this here, we have 2 carbon atoms. It is therefore called ethanal. And aldehydes always have the ending al. Ketones, it's slightly different. Our carbonyl group is flanked by 2 carbon atoms. An example here is propanone. Now, sometimes it's in the center of the molecule, sometimes it could be slightly towards the left or the right, but the idea is that it's always in the middle of two other carbon atoms that are either side of it. This here is propanone. Now, propanone is the first member of the homologous series ketones. You have to have a minimum of 3 carbons for a ketone. So our ketones always have the ending ONE. Examples of aldehydes and ketones, well, we have an example here of methanol. So methanol is otherwise known as formaldehyde, which is used as a preservative, and we've got a work about there by the artist Damien Hirst, where he preserved a shark in a tank using formaldehyde. Propanol has been detected near the center of the Milky Way, which I think is really cool, the fact that you can detect individual chemicals millions and millions of miles away. You may have used nail polish remover, that is acetone, or otherwise known as propanone. And you may have also heard of a ketogenic diet, which is whereby the individual consumes foods containing high fats as opposed to lots of carbohydrates, and the body then breaks down those fats into ketones. So there's a sort of similar ways that we've come across ketones, or whether you may be aware of ketones and aldehydes. In terms of naming, we follow the rules that we've done so far. So we have to identify where the functional group is. We then number our carbon atoms. And it's very, very similar, I suppose, to the hydroxyl groups for the alcohols. So in this instance here, we've got 2 isomers. We've got 5 carbons in each, but the carbonyl group is in a different place. Both of them are ketones. Maybe you could pause and sort of have a go. What do you think that these will be called? Try and use the same rules that we would use if this was an alcohol. So these two are pentan-3-one and pentan-2-one. The difference is where that carbonyl group is. On the left-hand side one, our carbons, the carbonyl group is right in the middle. So it doesn't really matter which side we start numbering the carbons from. But let's just take it from the left-hand side. So we could say that it's carbon 1, carbon 2, and there's our carbonyl on the 3rd carbon. On the right-hand side one, pentan-2-one, well, the carbonyl group in this drawing is slightly towards the left-hand side. So therefore, the furthest left carbon is the first, the second with the carbonyl group on is the second. Therefore, this is pentan-2-one. We also need to know how to do branched ketones and branched aldehydes. So could you have a go at this one, please? What do you think this would be called? So hopefully you've remembered that the functional group overrides any branches that we have. So in other words, we start numbering our carbons from the side closest to the functional group. So the furthest left carbon here would be our first carbon, our carbonyl group would then be our second, and then the one with the branch on would be our third. So our answer for this is 3-methyl pentan-2-one. So let's move on to naming aldehydes. We have 3 here. Why don't you have a go at this? I'll give you a little help if you can't remember. All of them will ending in AL. So methanol, ethanol, etc., etc. Off you go. Okay, so here's our 3 answers. We have methyl propanol. Remember, we don't need to signify where the carbonyl group is in an aldehyde because it's always going to be at the end of the molecule. So that carbon is always going to be the first carbon. For methyl propanol, we don't need to say 2-methyl propanol because it's the only place where that methyl group can go. It can't go on the end of the molecule, so it's just methyl propanol. The butanol on the furthest, on the right-hand side, that was sort of want to trick you a little bit. Some of you may have fallen for the trap in thinking that it is 3-methyl propanol because we have a sort of kind of looking like a branch going down, but if you remember, that isn't the branch, that's part of the longest carbon chain, therefore this is butanol. So that's naming aldehydes and ketones. So we're going to focus now on the chemical reactions that alcohols undergo, and specifically we're going to look at oxidation of carbon compounds. So here's our definition, if you could read that, please. So let's see that in action. We have here ethanol, and ethanol, if it undergoes oxidation, will change into a different chemical. In this case, it's changed into ethanal. So let's have a look at this oxygen to hydrogen ratio. We start off with 1 oxygen and 6 hydrogens. It is oxidized, and the ratio now changes to 1:4. So what has happened to the oxygen to hydrogen ratio? Well, in this case, it has increased. So we need to bear this in mind. We need to know this and remember this definition that for carbon compounds, oxidation means an increase in the oxygen to hydrogen ratio. So I guess what we're also interested in is how do we oxidize alcohols? Are all alcohols oxidized? By all, I mean primary, secondary, and tertiary. And then finally, how could we prove this? So normally, you probably guess we would do this as an experiment in school, but we can't. So could I ask you to go and watch this video? If you search testing alcohols by oxidation by Rugby School Chemistry, they've got a little video which shows you how to see which alcohols are oxidized and also how to oxidize them. So once you've done that, come back here and we'll go through the results and the conclusion. So I'm hoping you found or got from that video that primary and secondary alcohols are oxidized and tertiary alcohols are not oxidized at all. The oxidizing agents we used or were used in that video, well, they used acidified potassium dichromate. Acidified means it's got H+ ions in there as well to help the reaction. Now, acidified potassium dichromate starts off with this lovely orange color. It's kind of like the same as iron brew. And then when it is oxidized, or when it acts as an oxidizing agent rather, it goes to this greeny blue color. Now that's not the only oxidizing agent we could have used. We could have also used hot copper oxide. I couldn't really find a decent video for this one, but basically what happens is you put the coil of copper, or you could use copper filings, I suppose. Sorry, it's not copper, is it? We use the coil of copper oxide. That would then get dipped into the alcohol, which has been heated, and then it would change to elemental copper. So the oxygen would be removed and you'd just be left with copper. So those are our two oxidizing agents. And if you remember that one of the success criteria was, can you identify the oxidizing agents and the color changes as well? So this is an important slide. Let's now look at the actual chemistry. What are the primary and secondary alcohols being oxidized into? So we've got here a primary alcohol. This is ethanol. Once it undergoes oxidation, the first stage is that 2 hydrogens are being removed and it turns into ethanol, an aldehyde. That chemical then undergoes further oxidation and it changes into a carboxylic acid. In this case, we've had an oxygen added and it's turned into ethanoic acid. So our path, if you will, is the primary alcohol is oxidized first to an aldehyde and then to a carboxylic acid. And if we just check to see if oxidation has actually taken place, well, the way that we do that is by looking at the oxygen to hydrogen ratio. For the primary alcohol, it is 1:6. For the secondary, not for the secondary, for the aldehyde, it is 1:4. And then for the carboxylic acid, it is 1:2. And in each instance there, hopefully you can see that the oxygen to hydrogen ratio has increased. So that's the oxidation of primary alcohols. Let's look at secondary alcohols now. So with secondary alcohols, it's somewhat simpler. Here we've got propan-2-ol, our secondary alcohol, and once it undergoes oxidation, maybe using potassium dichromate or maybe using the hot copper oxide, 2 hydrogens are removed and now we form a ketone. So you can see maybe now why we were naming and learning a little bit about aldehydes and ketones at the beginning. So our secondary alcohol goes to a ketone. Our oxygen to hydrogen ratio with our secondary alcohol in this case is 1:8. In this ketone, it is 1:6. Our oxygen to hydrogen ratio has increased, therefore oxidation has taken place. So this here is a really, really useful summary. I think if you take away anything from this lesson, it is to commit this to memory. So this tells you everything you really need to know. Just a word of warning, it says there the aldehydes in brackets alkanals and the carboxylic acids in brackets alkanoic acids and the ketones are in brackets as alkanones. Those are the old names that we used. So just we're going to refer to them continuously as aldehydes, ketones, and carboxylic acids, but you may see them in old textbooks or old websites that haven't been updated using those old-fashioned names. So I think it's time to do some past paper questions. If you can have a go at this one, please. So you probably guessed that this is oxidation, which is the correct answer. But in the context of not having this lesson taught as an oxidation lesson, a lot of pupils often think that this is a condensation reaction because they see the chemical reaction happening, they've got two chemicals joining together, and then water is being expelled. So they instantly think condensation reaction, but it isn't a condensation reaction. Because in a condensation reaction, you have two small molecules forming one big molecule, and then water is expelled. And that isn't happening in this case. So what you could do is you could work out the oxygen to hydrogen ratio, and what you would find is that it is increased, therefore this is an oxidation reaction. Okay, this is a really tricky one, this. What I recommend you do is to work out the chemical reaction 4-methyl-pentan-2-ol, see what happens when that changes. So what does that change into? So the answer here is A, and here's why the answer is A. So we have here, this isn't the same chemical, but the idea is the same. We have a secondary alcohol and a ketone. And if you notice here, if you have 1 mole of this chemical, you're going to be removing 2 hydrogen atoms. Well, those hydrogen atoms, if you have 1 mole of them, they're going to have a mass of 2 grams. Therefore, for every mole of your secondary alcohol that you oxidize, you're going to lose 2 grams. Therefore, A is the correct answer. So one for you to draw here, draw the structural formula for the secondary alcohol with the formula C4H9OH. So here we go. This is pretty much the only answer you could come up with, I think. I think if you try to put a branch above the hydroxyl group, that would turn it into a tertiary alcohol. So yeah, I think this is the only one you could have done. Notice here as well how the carbon, the bond between the carbon and the oxygen is going to the oxygen. It isn't going to hydrogen, it's not going in the middle somewhere, it's not off to the side, it's going to that oxygen. It's really important that we do that as well in our tests and our exams. So 3 questions here. So why is a water bath used? Well, a water bath is used because the chemicals that we're using, the reactants and the products, are flammable. They could catch fire. So we can use a water bath as opposed to using a Bunsen burner. It's a lot safer. Describe the colour change that would have been observed with alcohols A and C. Well, the oxidizing agent that we're using is acidified potassium dichromate. Therefore, it would go from orange to greeny blue or blue-green or blue. Alcohol B is not oxidized. So what type of alcohol is that? It is a tertiary alcohol. So that's us done. So thank you for getting towards the end of this. So we have stated the functional group of aldehydes and ketones. We have named and drawn straight chain and branched aldehydes and ketones. We've defined oxidation and reduction in terms of carbon chemistry. And we've also stated 1, the products used, and 2, the oxidizing agents used when alcohols are oxidized. So if you guys can get the Google form to me, the quiz, as soon as possible. And if you have any questions, get them to me as well. Bye for now.